She called the cops on a simple family barbecue, accusing it of being illegal and a threat to the neighborhood. Karen, armed with false confidence and secret recordings, was determined to ruin Mark's evening, throwing around accusations as if she owned the law. It seemed like she had the upper hand, until her own actions came back to haunt her. One short video turned the tables, and what happened next left the entire neighborhood talking. But let's start from the beginning. Mark Thompson was the kind of guy who brought people together. His backyard in suburban Colorado wasn't just a yard, it was a gathering place. On sunny weekends, the smell of barbecue wafted through the neighborhood, mixing with the sound of country music and cheerful laughter. That Saturday was no different. Friends and family had gathered, kids played on the lawn, and Mark, spatula in hand, stood over his grill, flipping ribs to perfection. But no amount of good vibes could shield Mark from Karen Winters. Karen was the neighbor everyone knew, but no one wanted to deal with. With her immaculate lawn and her self-appointed role as the neighborhood enforcer, she found problems where there were none. If it wasn't the mailbox being the wrong shade of beige, it was kids playing basketball on the street. And today, she had set her sights on Mark. The first sign of trouble was the clack of Karen's heels on the patio. She marched through the side gate, uninvited, her expression a mix of indignation and determination. She pointed dramatically at the grill, her voice loud enough to silence the chatter around her. "This is a violation of city noise ordinances and air quality laws," she announced. "Shut this down immediately, or I'll call the authorities." Mark, still holding his spatula, raised an eyebrow. "Karen, it's a barbecue, not a stadium concert. Take a breath." Karen wasn't having it. "This is an illegal gathering. Too many people, too much noise. This is unacceptable," she snapped, before spinning on her heel and storming off, muttering about reporting this. Mark sighed as his guests exchanged amused looks. Karen's antics weren't new, but they were never pleasant. Still, he shrugged it off, assuming she'd vent and let it go. He was wrong. Not 10 minutes later, the hum of conversation was interrupted by the flash of red and blue lights. A police car rolled up to the curb, and the party fell silent. Mark wiped his hands on a towel and walked to the front yard, his guests trailing behind. Karen was already there, her hands gesturing wildly as she spoke to the officers. "Thank goodness you're here. They're disturbing the peace, burning who knows what, and hosting some unauthorized event without permits." Mark approached calmly, his voice steady. "Afternoon, officers. Can I help you with something?" Officer Daniels, the older of the two, looked between Karen and Mark. "We received a complaint about a disturbance. Mind explaining what's going on?" Karen cut in, eager to make her case. "It's chaos back there. Smoke, noise, too many people. It's against every regulation." Mark chuckled softly, gesturing to the backyard. "It's just a family BBQ. Feel free to take a look." Daniels nodded, motioning for his partner to follow. Karen trailed behind, her smirk suggesting she thought she'd won. But as they rounded the corner, the scene in the backyard was anything but incriminating. The grill was a standard propane setup, not the smoke-belching charcoal monster Karen had described. The music, now turned down, was barely louder than a murmur. Guests stood or sat in small groups, chatting and sipping drinks. It was the picture of a peaceful gathering. Daniels turned to Karen, his expression neutral. "Ma'am, this doesn't appear to be a violation of any laws. It's private property, and nothing here warrants intervention." Karen's face turned an impressive shade of red. "But the smoke, the noise, it's unacceptable," she insisted. Mark couldn't help himself. "Karen, your house is 3 doors down. If this bothered you, I think you'd have mentioned it before now." The guests chuckled, and even the younger officer suppressed a smile. Daniels, however, remained professional. "Unless there's something more, there's no issue here. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Thompson." Karen glared at Mark, clearly not satisfied but unwilling to press further in front of the officers. She turned abruptly and marched home, muttering under her breath. As the police left, Mark's guests began laughing and joking about the absurdity of the situation. Mark returned to his grill, flipping a steak with a grin. But as the laughter faded, a thought lingered in his mind. Was Karen really finished? Knowing her, the answer was probably no. The backyard fell silent as a police cruiser rolled up to the curb. Mark's guests exchanged uneasy glances, and Mark, still holding his towel, walked toward the front yard with a mix of irritation and resignation. There, Karen was already in full performance mode, gesturing wildly at the officers. "Thank goodness you're here, officers. These people are disturbing the peace and polluting the environment with toxic fumes." Her tone was theatrical enough to rival a stage play, and Mark had to suppress a sigh as he stepped forward. "Afternoon, officers," he said calmly. "What seems to be the problem?" Before they could answer, Karen cut in, pointing emphatically toward the backyard. "They're hosting an unauthorized event. I'm sure they don't have permits, and the noise is disrupting the entire neighborhood." Officer Daniels, the more seasoned of the two, looked from Karen to Mark. His tone was steady and professional as he addressed Mark. "Sir, do you have identification? Can you tell us what's going on here?" Mark handed over his ID without hesitation, gesturing toward the yard. "It's just a family BBQ, officer. No loud music, no rowdy behavior, just food and conversation. Feel free to check for yourself." Karen, however, wasn't about to let the matter drop. "I demand you shut this down immediately. I know my rights as a concerned citizen, and this is completely unacceptable." The rookie officer, looking uncertain, began to jot something in his notepad, but Daniel stopped him with a raised hand. His voice was calm but firm. "Ma'am, let's not escalate things unnecessarily. If it's just a private gathering, there's no law against it." Karen's face flushed, her frustration visible as she crossed her arms tightly. Mark led the officers to the backyard, where the peaceful scene immediately undercut Karen's claims. The grill was a modest propane setup, safely stationed on the patio and emitting only the savory aroma of ribs. Guests were seated in small groups, chatting quietly, while a few kids played with a frisbee on the lawn. It was a picture-perfect family gathering. Daniels took a moment to assess the scene before turning back to Karen, who had followed close behind, clearly hoping for a different outcome. "Ma'am, this doesn't appear to be a disturbance. The grill is safe, the noise is minimal, and everything is within their rights as property owners." Karen's frustration bubbled over. "But the smoke, it's toxic, and the noise earlier was deafening." Mark couldn't help but chuckle softly. "Karen, your house is 3 doors down. If the noise was that bad, I'd think you'd have mentioned it sooner." The rookie officer stifled a grin, while Daniels remained composed but firm. "Unless you have evidence of a serious violation, there's nothing further for us to address here. I suggest leaving these folks to enjoy their day." Karen stood there, momentarily speechless, before storming off toward her house with a huff. As the officers returned to their car, Daniels nodded at Mark. "Sorry for the trouble. Everything looks fine here. Have a good day." Mark smiled. "Appreciate you checking it out, officer." As the cruiser pulled away, the tension dissolved, and Mark's guests began to laugh, toasting his calm handling of the situation. Mark returned to his grill, flipping a steak with a grin. But even as the party resumed, a nagging thought lingered. Karen didn't seem like the type to give up that easily. Karen wasn't about to back down. With a dramatic flourish, she pulled out her phone and began scrolling furiously, her expression one of smug determination. "Officers, I have proof," she announced, holding the screen toward them. "Look at this. More than 10 people, and they're drinking alcohol in public view." She had been recording Mark's party earlier, secretly peeking over the fence to capture footage. The guests, visible in her shaky video, were doing little more than chatting, laughing, and enjoying their drinks responsibly. But Karen's exaggerated narration in the background turned the clip into something out of context. "See? They're turning this neighborhood into a circus. It's outrageous." Officer Daniels frowned, taking a moment to view the video. He handed the phone back to Karen with a calm but firm response. "Ma'am, this is private property. There's nothing in the law that prohibits gatherings of this size here. As for drinking, it's not illegal on private property." Karen's smirk faltered for a moment before she quickly switched gears, desperate to keep her complaints relevant. "Fine, but they're burning charcoal without proper ventilation. That smoke is toxic and dangerous, especially to children." She crossed her arms as if daring Mark to dispute her. Mark, now thoroughly exasperated, took a deep breath and stepped in. "Officer, it's a gas grill," he said, his voice level but tinged with frustration. "You're welcome to see for yourself." Daniels nodded, clearly wanting to put the matter to rest. He followed Mark to the backyard, where the scene was as peaceful as before. The modest propane grill stood proudly on the patio, its blue flames safely contained under the lid. The faint aroma of BBQ ribs hung in the air, far from the toxic fumes Karen had described. The officer crouched briefly to inspect the grill, then straightened up, turning to Karen. "Ma'am, this is a standard propane grill. There's no charcoal here and no safety concerns. Do you have any other issues to raise?" Karen's face turned a deeper shade of red, her frustration now evident to everyone watching. Her earlier confidence had crumbled, but she still refused to admit defeat. They're violating the peace of the neighborhood. People shouldn't have to put up with this level of disruption. Mark couldn't hold back a wry smile. "Karen, it's a family BBQ. If anything, the neighborhood could use more of this kind of peace." Daniels gave her a measured look, his tone patient, but unyielding. "Ma'am, unless you can point to a clear violation, we can't take this further. Everything here checks out." Karen stood frozen for a moment, seemingly at a loss for words, before huffing loudly and muttering something under her breath. She turned abruptly and stomped back toward her house, leaving behind an air of awkward tension. Mark exhaled, shaking his head as he looked at the officers. "Sorry you had to deal with that. Thanks for taking the time to check everything out." Daniels gave him a small nod. "No problem. It's clear you're within your rights. Have a good rest of your day." As the officers walked back to their cruiser, the guests in the backyard erupted into soft laughter, the tension finally breaking. Mark returned to his grill, flipping a steak with a grin while someone raised a drink in mock salute. But even as the party resumed its earlier energy, Mark couldn't help but glance toward Karen's house. He knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to let go easily, and he had a feeling she'd be back with another scheme before long. As the officers turned to leave, seemingly ready to close the case, Mark's teenage son, Jake, walked up with his phone in hand, a cautious but determined look on his face. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying just enough urgency to halt everyone in their tracks. "I think you'll want to see this." Curious, Mark leaned closer as Jake tapped the screen and played a video recorded earlier that day by their backyard security camera. The footage wasn't just revealing, it was damning. The video clearly showed Karen balancing precariously on a ladder, peering over the fence into their yard. She wasn't just observing, though. A few moments later, the camera caught her using a broom to push a pile of leaves from her yard into Mark's, scattering them strategically to create the illusion of a mess. The final blow, Karen's voice, loud and unmistakable, yelling into the yard. "You'll regret this party, Mark. You're ruining this neighborhood." Mark couldn't suppress a grin as the officers watched the footage, their expressions shifting from mild patience to quiet incredulity. Officer Daniels, the seasoned professional, straightened and turned to Karen, his voice firm. "Ma'am, do you realize trespassing and littering are both offenses? This video gives us grounds to investigate further." Karen's bravado visibly crumbled. She stepped back, her eyes darting between the officers and Mark. I was just trying to keep the neighborhood clean," she stammered, her voice losing its earlier authority. "That family is always making a mess, and someone has to do something about it." Mark crossed his arms, tilting his head with a mix of amusement and exasperation. "Karen, I think the evidence speaks for itself. Maybe it's time to head home and let everyone enjoy their day." The guests in the yard were now gathered near the fence, whispering to each other and stifling chuckles. Even the rookie officer couldn't hide the faintest hint of a smirk, though he quickly regained his composure as Daniels continued. "Ma'am, this kind of behavior only escalates tensions. I suggest you reconsider your approach in the future. For now, I think it's best you return to your property and leave these folks to theirs." Karen opened her mouth as if to protest, but seemed to think better of it. With a huff, she turned and marched back to her house, her shoulders stiff and her steps quick. The sound of her door slamming echoed faintly across the yard. As the tension lifted, the backyard erupted into laughter and cheers. One of the guests clapped Mark on the back, grinning. "You handled that like a champ," Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "Just another day with Karen, I guess." The officers offered a polite goodbye, and Daniels gave Mark a final nod. "You got a good head on your shoulders, Mr. Thompson. Don't let situations like this ruin your day." "Thanks, officer," Mark replied sincerely. "I appreciate you taking the time to sort this out." As the police car pulled away, the party gradually returned to its earlier energy. Mark flipped a burger with a grin, but the memory of Karen's antics lingered. One thing was clear: Karen might have lost this round, but knowing her, she wasn't done yet. Still, for now, the The smell of barbecue and the sound of laughter filled the air once again, and the moment was Mark's to savor. Officer Daniels stood tall, his calm but firm demeanor leaving no room for argument. "Ma'am," he began, addressing Karen directly, "trespassing and filing false complaints are serious matters. This is your formal warning. Any further incidents like this, and there will be legal consequences." Karen's face turned a deep shade of red as she sputtered, searching for a retort that wouldn't come. Her earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by visible frustration. She muttered something under her breath, too low to be heard, but enough to hint at her lingering defiance. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stomped back toward her house, her rigid posture radiating indignation. The yard was silent for a brief moment, as if everyone collectively processed what had just happened. Then, as the police car pulled away, the energy shifted. Laughter and applause broke out among Mark's guests, relief and amusement washing over the group. One of the neighbors leaned over the fence, holding a tray of cookies. "Looks like you handled that like a pro, Mark," she said with a grin. Another neighbor followed, carrying a bowl of chips, and soon more people began trickling over, their hands full of snacks and drinks as a show of solidarity. Mark raised an eyebrow, amused. "What's this? A block party now?" he joked, setting down his spatula to help arrange the new contributions. Someone handed him a cold beer, and Mark took it with a nod of gratitude. Holding it up in a mock toast, he smirked. To Karen, may she finally learn to mind her own business. The crowd erupted into laughter, the tension of the day fully replaced by lighthearted camaraderie. Mark's backyard, now even more crowded than before, became a hub of cheerful conversation and clinking glasses. The smell of barbecue filled the air again, blending with the warm hum of neighbors, bonding over shared relief from Karen's antics. For weeks afterward, Mark's BBQ became the talk of the neighborhood, not just for the food, but for the way he handled the situation with patience and grace. Karen's reign of terror began to wane, as other residents found the courage to call her out on her overbearing behavior. As the evening wound down, Mark leaned back in his chair, surveying the lively group. His guests were laughing, kids were chasing fireflies, and the air was filled with the comforting crackle of the grill. "Sometimes," he said, raising his voice just enough for those nearby to hear, "all it takes to deal with a Karen is a good BBQ and a little patience." The sentiment was met with cheers and a few playful clinks of glasses. For Mark, the night was a reminder that a tight-knit community and a sense of humor could overcome even the most persistent challenges. And for Karen? Well, it seemed her days of unchecked interference were finally numbered.